The laptop wasn't even mine. That's the part I keep coming back to. I was sitting at Denise's kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in March, trying to print a boarding pass for a trip I never ended up taking, because her printer was newer than mine and hers actually worked. She'd handed me the laptop, told me the password was still taped under the mousepad, the way it had been for 2 years, and gone outside to bring in groceries with her husband, Curtis. I opened the browser to find the airline website. Instead, a notification slid down from the top corner of the screen, a text message, synced from her phone the way messages do now, appearing on any device signed into the same account whether you want them to or not. Curtis, did you tell your dad about the cabin yet, Denise? No, and I'm not going to, not this trip, Curtis. We need an answer before June, Denise. I know. Just let it sit. Don't tell Dad, he won't be around much longer anyway. Easier to deal with it after I read it twice. Then a third time the way you reread something hoping the words will rearrange themselves into a version that doesn't hurt as much. They didn't rearrange. They just sat there on the screen, glowing, patient, the way bad news always is once it's already been said. My name is Harold Whitfield. I'm 68 years old. I spent 41 years building a hardware and lumber business from a single rented storefront into 3 locations across the county. I buried my wife 4 years ago, and until that Sunday afternoon, I believed my daughter and I understood each other completely. That message is the reason everything that came after happened the way it did. If you've ever found out exactly how someone talks about you when they think you'll never see it, I should explain the cabin and my wife before I explain what came after. Margaret and I bought the place on Lake Wren the same year Denise turned 6. Back when the lots up there were still cheap enough for a hardware store owner to afford one without financing it through his own store's supply account, which I'll admit I did anyway, quietly, paying myself back over 3 winters nobody but Margaret and I ever knew about. A 2-bedroom cabin with a leaning dock and a wood stove that smoked if the wind came from the wrong direction. But Margaret planted irises along the path down to the water the first summer we owned it, and every summer after that, for 31 years, those irises came back whether we tended them or not, stubborn and purple, and completely unbothered by how little either of us understood about gardening. Denise learned to swim off that dock. Her brother Kevin learned to fish there, badly, catching more of his own line than actual fish for most of his childhood. Margaret used to say the cabin wasn't a building. It was a container for every good version of our family that ever existed, the versions before mortgages and grudges and grown children who stopped calling as often as they used to. The business had a similar story, though a longer and harder one. I started Whitfield Hardware in a rented storefront the year Kevin was born, working the counter myself 6 days a week while Margaret kept the books at our kitchen table with Denise asleep in a bassinet beside her chair. For the first 4 years, we didn't take a single vacation because every dollar that came in either went back into inventory or into a savings account earmarked, quietly, for 2 futures that didn't exist yet. By the time we opened the second location, out past the county line, Denise was old enough to sweep the back room for $1 an hour, and Kevin was old enough to complain loudly about being made to do the same for the exact same wage his sister earned, an early and accurate preview of the 2 very different children they'd grow into. Kevin left for the West Coast the year he turned 24 and never really came back, not in any way that counted. He calls on my birthday, faithfully, and again around the holidays, conversations that last exactly as long as good manners require and not a minute longer. I don't say that with bitterness. Some children build their lives close to home, and some build them far away, and neither choice is a referendum on how much love exists underneath it. But it does mean that, for most practical purposes, over the last decade, Denise has been the child in the room, the one at the hospital when I had my stent placed, the The one who drove 2 hours in a snowstorm the week after Margaret's funeral just to make sure I was eating something besides toast. The one whose voice I associated, until that Sunday afternoon in March, almost entirely with steadiness. That's part of what made the message so difficult to absorb. It hadn't come from the distant child. It had come from the close one, the one I trusted precisely because she'd never given me a specific reason not to. When Margaret got sick, 6 years ago now, we stopped going up as often. The last summer she was strong enough to make the trip, she sat on the dock for 4 straight hours in a folding chair, wrapped in a blanket despite the July heat, just watching the water, and she told me something I've thought about nearly every day since. "When I'm gone," she said, "don't let anyone talk you into selling this place quickly. Grief makes people want to simplify everything. Sometimes the thing they're trying to simplify is the only thing still holding the family together." I promised her I wouldn't. I kept that promise for 4 years, through a heart procedure of my own, a stent, nothing dramatic, though the hospital paperwork used the word cardiac event, which had apparently done more damage to how my children saw me than it had done to my actual heart through 2 Thanksgivings that felt thinner than they used to, through a slow, creeping sense that Denise and Kevin had started talking about me the way you talk about a house you're planning to sell. Fondly. From a distance. Already halfway moved on. I didn't fully understand what that sense meant until I read 4 lines of text on a laptop that wasn't mine. There had been signs. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story as though the message appeared out of nowhere, a lightning strike on a clear day. It wasn't that. It was the last card in a hand that had been quietly assembling itself for over a year. The first sign came at Christmas 14 months earlier when Curtis mentioned, almost offhand over the ham, that he'd been looking into some estate planning options just to be prepared. I remember thinking it was thoughtful, practical, the kind of thing a good son-in-law does. Prepared for what? I'd asked, genuinely curious. "Just Curtis said, glancing at Denise. "Whatever comes, nobody's getting younger." Denise had laughed it off, changed the subject to Kevin's new job, and I let it go because at 67 at a family dinner, "nobody's getting younger" felt like an unremarkable thing for a 50-year-old son-in-law to say to his aging father-in-law. I didn't yet understand it as a rehearsal. The second sign came 3 months later, when Denise started asking, with increasing frequency, whether I'd thought any more about simplifying things. She never said what things. I assumed she meant downsizing the house maybe, or finally getting rid of my old truck, the one with 190,000 miles on it that ran perfectly well and that I had absolutely no intention of replacing. Simplifying what exactly? I'd asked her once over the phone. Just assets. The cabin. The business accounts you kept open after you sold the stores. It'd be easier for everyone if things were more organized before. She'd stopped herself. Before what? "Before anything happens," she said. Just in general." I told her I'd think about it, the way you tell your children things to end a conversation rather than because you mean it, and I hadn't thought about it again until that Sunday afternoon in her kitchen, staring at a text message that finally translated 14 months of vague, circling conversation into 4 plain, terrible words. There was a third sign too, smaller than the other 2, easy to miss if you weren't already looking. Denise had started ending our phone calls differently, not with "talk soon" or "love you, Dad," the way she'd always signed off, but increasingly with "take care of yourself," said in a tone that carried an odd, clinical weight, the tone you might use with a coworker heading into a risky procedure rather than a father you expected to keep talking to indefinitely. I'd noticed it. I hadn't understood it. I had simply filed it away, the same way you file away a strange noise in an old house, telling yourself houses make noises. That's just what old houses do. He won't be around much longer anyway, not a diagnosis. Not a doctor's warning. Just an assumption, casually deployed, useful mainly because it meant nobody had to have an honest conversation with me while I was still around to have it. I closed the laptop. I want to be clear that I didn't slam it, didn't storm outside, didn't do any of the things a man in a movie might do in that moment. I simply closed it, the way you'd close a door on a room you weren't ready to walk fully into yet, and I sat at Denise's kitchen table with my hands flat against the wood, breathing in a way I hadn't had to think about breathing since the week after Margaret's diagnosis. Denise came back inside a few minutes later, arms full of grocery bags, cheerful in the ordinary way people are cheerful when they have no idea their whole world is about to shift 6 inches to the left. "Did you get the boarding pass printed?" she asked. "Printer's acting up," I said. It was the first lie I'd told her in longer than I could remember, and it came out of me easily, which frightened me more than the lie itself did. I stayed for another hour. I ate the sandwich. I talked about Kevin's new job and the Wilsons' new fence, and whether the Lions had a real shot this season. And the entire time, 4 lines of text sat behind my eyes like a stone I'd swallowed and couldn't quite feel settle. On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I drove the back roads instead of the highway, the long way, past the turnoff for Lake Wren, though I had no intention of going up there that day. Just needing, I think, to be near the idea of it. Margaret's voice kept surfacing in my memory, unprompted, the way it does sometimes when I least expect it. Grief makes people want to simplify everything. I hadn't understood when she said it that some people don't wait for the grief. Some people start simplifying while you're still very much alive to feel yourself being simplified. I got home a little after 6. I sat in my recliner, the good one, the one Margaret picked out the year before she got sick, worn soft in exactly the shape of me now, and I didn't turn on the television. I just sat there in the quiet, turning the message over and over, looking for an angle that would make it hurt less. I never found one. I called my attorney, Ellen Vasquez, first thing Monday morning. Ellen had handled the sale of my third hardware store 15 years earlier and had done my and Margaret's original estate planning not long after, back when the biggest decision in front of us was whether Kevin's college fund needed a separate account from Denise's. She'd known our family a long time. She didn't ask many questions when I told her I wanted to come in. "Everything all right, Harold?" she asked. The kind of question you ask a client whose voice sounds different. "I want to update my will," I said, "and I don't want to talk about why over the phone." I drove to her office that afternoon. I remember very little about the drive, only that I stopped for gas I didn't need, the same way you sometimes find reasons to delay walking into a room you know is going to change something permanently. Ellen's office smelled the way it always had: old paper, coffee, the particular mustiness of a building that had survived 3 different downtown revitalization plans without anyone ever actually revitalizing it. She sat across from me with a legal pad, and her reading glasses pushed up into gray hair that had gotten grayer since the last time I'd seen her. "Tell me what changed," she said, so I told her. About the laptop and the message, and 14 months of small, circling conversations about simplifying things that I'd been too trusting, or too tired, or too grateful for my children's continued presence in my life, to properly examine. Ellen listened without interrupting, the way good attorneys and good doctors both learn to do, and when I finished, she took off her reading glasses and set them down on the legal pad. "I'm sorry, Harold," she said. "It's an ugly thing to find out by accident. It's an uglier thing to have been true for over a year without my knowing it," I said. "What do you want to do?" I'd thought about this the entire drive over, turning it the way you turn a tool in your hand before deciding whether it's the right one for the job. "I don't want to punish anyone," I said. "I'm not interested in cutting Denise out entirely out of some kind of spite. That's not who Margaret and I raised them to have as a father. But I am not going to keep structuring my affairs around the comfort of people who are already planning around my death like it's a logistics problem to be managed rather than a loss to be grieved. What does that look like, practically? The cabin goes into a trust, I said. Not to be sold, not to be divided, not to be leveraged for anyone's convenience, for as long as I'm alive to have a say in it. When I'm gone, it passes to whichever of my grandchildren actually uses it spends real time there. Not once a decade for a photo determined by a trustee, not by whoever gets to me first with the smoothest argument. The rest of the estate, I want restructured so that generosity has to be earned through relationship, not assumed as an inheritance owed regardless of how a person treats me while I'm still breathing. Ellen wrote for a long time without looking up. That's a significant restructuring, she finally said. It's also, for what it's worth, one of the more reasonable responses I've seen to a situation like this. Some people come in here wanting to cut everyone out entirely over far less than what you just described. I thought about it, I admitted. The anger wanted that, but anger's a bad architect, Ellen. It builds things you have to live in for the rest of your life, and I intend to live for a good while longer, whatever my daughter's calendar assumes about that. She smiled, small and a little sad. How long do you want before we finalize the changes? Draft it this week, I said. I want it signed before anyone in my family knows I've done it. For the next month, I told no one. I want to describe what that month felt like because it surprised me. I expected guilt. I expected the low, grinding sense of having done something underhanded, sneaking around behind my own daughter's back the way she and Curtis had apparently been sneaking around behind mine. Instead, what I felt was something closer to Margaret's old irises coming back up along the path, to the lake, a slow, stubborn kind of resilience I hadn't realized I still had in me. I started doing things I'd been putting off for years. I finally replaced the transmission in the old truck instead of nursing it along another winter, because I decided I wasn't interested in being talked into a newer, safer car by people who apparently didn't expect me to be driving much longer anyway. I signed up for a woodworking class at the community college, something Margaret had suggested a dozen times over the years that I'd always waved off as too indulgent for a man who already spent all day around lumber. I drove up to Lake Wren by myself on a Tuesday afternoon in April, sat on the dock in the same folding chair Margaret used to use, and let the cold spring wind do exactly what it wanted to my face without flinching away from it. I called an old friend from the Rotary Club, Ted Halloran, a retired dentist who'd lost his wife the same year I lost Margaret, and we started meeting for breakfast on Thursdays, something I hadn't done regularly since I sold the third. Ted had a way of saying things plainly that I'd always appreciated. "You seem different lately," he told me over eggs one Thursday. "Lighter almost. Something happened. Found out how some people plan to handle my death," I said. "Decided to handle my life instead." Ted laughed, the short, surprised laugh of a man who wasn't expecting a punchline that dark that early in the morning. "That's either the saddest thing you've ever said to me or the healthiest. Possibly both." "Both." My wife used to say people don't usually get to choose just one. The call came on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after I'd read that message on Denise's laptop, 6 days after Ellen had filed the completed trust documents with the county recorder's office. Curtis had gone looking for the cabin deed for something entirely unrelated, a boat insurance policy. As it turned out, something requiring proof of the property's ownership structure, and had discovered, instead of the simple joint ownership he expected, a newly recorded trust with restrictions neither he nor Denise had any part in drafting. My phone rang at 7:40. I let it go to voicemail, mostly out of habit, mostly because I was in the middle of sanding a bookshelf I'd started in my woodworking class and had grout sawdust, rather covering both hands. By the time I wiped them clean, there were 3 more missed calls stacked beneath the first, then 5 more. Then over the following half hour, while I stood at my kitchen counter and simply let the phone ring itself into silence again and again, the number climbed past 15, then 25, until it finally settled when I stopped counting, somewhere north of 40. The texts arrived in the gaps between calls, each one a little more frantic than the last. Dad, call me right now. What is this trust thing Curtis found for the cabin? Dad, this doesn't make any sense. Please call. Are you? Is something wrong? Did something happen with your health? I read that last one 3 times. Is something wrong? Did something happen with your health? Not are we okay? Not did I do something? Just an immediate, reflexive check of the one variable that had apparently mattered to her for over a year, whether the clock she and Curtis had been quietly watching had suddenly started moving faster than expected. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long while, listening to the quiet, steady hum of the refrigerator, thinking about something Margaret used to say when Denise and Kevin were teenagers, and she'd catch them telling half-truths to smooth over some small domestic crime. A lie doesn't need to be discovered to do its damage. It does the damage the moment it's told. Discovery just tells you how much damage has already accumulated. I thought about 14 months of small, circling half-truths about simplifying things and being prepared. And I understood, finally, exactly how much damage had accumulated before I'd ever touched Denise's laptop at all. Eventually, I listened to the voicemails in order, the way you'd read a diary someone else had written about their own unraveling without ever meaning for you to see it. The first was tight and controlled, the voice of a woman trying to sound calmer. Dad, hey, it's me. Curtis found something weird with the cabin paperwork. Probably nothing. Just call me back when you get a second. By the fourth message, the control had started slipping. Dad, I really need you to call me. This trust document doesn't make any sense. Why would you file something like this without even mentioning it to us? By the ninth, panic had crept fully into her voice. Dad, please, I don't understand what's happening. Is everything okay? Did the doctor say something? Did your heart? Please just call me back. I'm getting really scared. By the 17th, the fear had curdled into something closer to anger, the particular anger of someone realizing they might have lost control of a narrative they'd assumed was entirely theirs to manage. Okay, this is starting to feel really unfair. You can't just make a decision like this and not tell anyone. That's not how families are supposed to work. I sat with that one for a long time. That's not how families are supposed to work. As though there had been a shared rulebook all along, one she'd simply forgotten she'd broken first, back in March. In a text message she never expected anyone but Curtis to read. I thought about something my old accountant used to tell me, back in the early years of the store, about the difference between a discrepancy and a pattern. One bad month doesn't tell you anything. It's the trend line that tells you the truth about a business. For 14 months, I had been watching a trend line without letting myself name it for what it was: a slow, steady drift from being consulted to being managed, from being loved actively to being loved only in the abstract, contingent on my continued cooperation and eventual, convenient absence. I finally answered on the 43rd call. Before we get into what happened when she showed up at my door that night, if this story has you hooked, make sure you're subscribed and tap that like button. It really helps this channel grow. Now back to the story. Dad, thank God, Denise said, before I'd even finished saying hello. What is going on with the cabin trust? Curtis found some document with a lawyer's name on it we've never even heard of. This is insane. Why would you do something like this without talking to us first? I think you should come over, I said. In person. I'll explain everything then. Dad, just tell me now. I don't understand why you're being so in person, Denise. My voice stayed even, the same even, measured tone I used to use walking a difficult customer through a warranty dispute at the store, the tone that had served me well for 41 years of disagreements that needed more clarity than heat. I'll see you tonight. She arrived 40 minutes later, alone, without Curtis. Her car pulling into my driveway too fast and stopping too hard. The way people drive when they've spent the entire trip rehearsing an argument they haven't yet realized they don't have the footing to win. She came in without knocking, the way she'd always done, and stood in my kitchen still wearing her coat, too agitated to sit. "Okay," she said. "I'm here. Explain it to me. Why did you tell Curtis not to talk?" Her face did something complicated, surprise first, then underneath it, something closer to dawning dread. "What are you talking about, March?" I said. "Your kitchen. I used your laptop to try to print a boarding pass and a text came through. Yours to Curtis, about the cabin, about not telling me yet." I watched the color drain slowly out of her face, the particular pale of someone realizing a private room they'd assumed had no windows had in fact had one all along. "I need you to stop," I said, gentle but firm, the way I stopped Ted mid-sentence sometimes when he tried to soften a hard truth before I'd even finished hearing it. "I need you to stop explaining before you've even confirmed what you're explaining. Just tell me what the message said in your own words. I want to hear you say it." She sat down heavily in the chair across from me, the same chair she'd sat in doing algebra homework at this same table 30 years earlier, and put both hands over her face. "I told Curtis not to bring up the cabin conversation with you yet," she said, muffled through her fingers, "because I wasn't ready to have it. That's not all it said." Her hands came down slowly. "I said you wouldn't be around much longer anyway." "God, Dad, I say the rest of it," I said. "I already know what it said. I want to know if you're capable of saying it to my face." It took her a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone thin and small. "I said it would be easier to deal with everything after," she said. "After you're gone." The kitchen went very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, the old clock Margaret's mother had left us ticked through the silence, indifferent, the way clocks always are to the worst moments people have in front of them. "Do you understand what that sentence did to me?" I asked. "Not the estate planning, not the cabin. The sentence itself. You didn't say you were worried about my health. You didn't say you were scared of losing me. You said it would be easier, as though I'm a project with a deadline you're impatiently waiting on, rather than your father, who is still very much sitting across this table from you, alive and listening." "That's not what I meant," she said, crying now, the particular guilty crying of someone who knows the defense they are offering isn't going to hold. "I didn't mean it like it sounds. I don't think intent changes what it revealed," I said. "I think it revealed that somewhere in the last year, you and Curtis stopped seeing conversations with me as something you owed me, and started seeing them as something you could schedule around my convenient absence. That my death became, in some part of your planning, a solution to an inconvenience, rather than a loss you were dreading." Curtis arrived 20 minutes later, having gotten the same anxious summons from Denise that had apparently brought her here in the first place, though visibly reluctant about it. He walked in already talking, the way nervous men sometimes do when they're trying to control a room before the room has decided what it thinks of them. "Harold, listen, whatever Denise told you, I think there's context missing here. We were just trying to be practical about." "Sit down, Curtis." He looked at Denise's tear-streaked face, then at my expression, and whatever he'd rehearsed in the car apparently evaporated on contact with the actual temperature of the room. "What's going on?" he said, quieter now. "I restructured my estate," I said. "The cabin's in a trust now, protected from being sold, divided, or leveraged by anyone, including the two of you, for as long as I'm alive to say otherwise. I did this after discovering that the two of you have spent over a year quietly planning around an assumption that I wouldn't live long enough for it to matter whether I found out." "That's Harold. That's not fair. We were just being practical. Everyone has to think about these things eventually." "I don't disagree that families should plan," I said. "Margaret and I planned for decades. What I object to is being planned around. There's a difference between preparing for the future with someone and preparing for their absence as though it's already decided, already convenient, already underway. One of those is love with foresight. The other is patience wearing love's coat until it doesn't need to anymore. Curtis's jaw tightened, the particular tightening of a man who knows he's lost an argument but hasn't yet found the grace to stop having it. "We didn't mean it the way it sounds," he tried. "You said it," I said, plainly in writing where I could see it. "I've spent 41 years reading contracts, Curtis. I know the difference between something said carelessly and something said as an operating assumption. That message wasn't a slip. It was a strategy, casually confirmed." There was a long stretch of quiet after that, the kind that isn't empty so much as full of things nobody has decided how to say yet. Curtis sat back in his chair, some of the fight visibly draining out of him now that the room had made clear it wasn't going to reward him for maintaining it. "Can I ask you something?" he said, quieter now. "And I'd like an honest answer, not the version you'd give me just to keep the peace." "All right. Is this really about the message? Or is this about the money? Because if you wanted to punish us financially, there'd be simpler ways to do it than a trust with this many restrictions." I considered the question longer than he probably expected me to. "It was never about the money," I said. "I could give that cabin away tomorrow and it wouldn't change one thing about what that message revealed. This was never a financial decision, Curtis. It was a relational one. The trust isn't designed to protect an asset from being sold. It's designed to protect a place that matters to this family from being managed by people who have already demonstrated they are willing to plan around my absence rather than have an honest conversation with my presence." "That seems like an awfully large structure to build around one text message," Curtis said, and I could hear underneath the defensiveness something closer to genuine confusion, the confusion of a man who'd always believed pragmatism and callousness were simply the same instinct wearing different clothes, and hadn't yet learned to tell them apart. "It isn't one message," I said. "It's 14 months of small conversations that message finally translated for me. The Christmas comment about estate planning, the repeated questions about simplifying things, the vague sense every time we spoke that I was being managed toward an outcome instead of included in a decision. The message didn't create that pattern. It just finally let me see it clearly enough to name it out loud. So what happens now? Are we supposed to walk on eggshells for the rest of your life, worried every conversation might get flagged as evidence?" "No," I said. "You're supposed to have honest conversations with me, the way you would with anyone you respected and didn't expect to be inconvenienced by for much longer. That's not walking on eggshells, Curtis. That's just what it looks like to treat someone as though they're still fully here." He didn't have an answer for that. There wasn't one that would have held up under any real scrutiny, and to his credit, he seemed to understand that rather than continuing to search for one. Denise made a small, broken sound. "What does this mean for us? Are we cut off now? Is that what this is?" "No," I said, and I watched something in both their faces loosen slightly, the particular relief of people who'd braced for total demolition and found, instead, only a serious structural repair. "I'm not interested in punishing you the way you assumed I'd be too dead to notice being punished. But I am not going to spend whatever years I have left quietly financing an inheritance that gets collected on a timeline you've already started counting down. If you want a relationship with me, a real one, not a waiting room, it starts now, today, with honesty. Not with strategy. I want to pause here, because this is the part people always assume is simple, and it isn't. I did not enjoy watching my daughter cry at my kitchen table. I have loved Denise since the day the doctor placed her, red-faced and outraged at the whole experience of being born, into my arms 36 years ago, and nothing about that message changed the fact of that love. But love, Margaret used to tell me, is not the same thing as being taken for granted, and somewhere over the last 14 months I had let those two things blur together so completely I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. "I keep thinking about how normal it must have felt," I said, more to myself than to either of them, talking about me that way, planning around my absence like it was simply a matter of scheduling. When did that become normal, Denise? I don't know, she said, wiping her face with the sleeve of her coat. It didn't feel like betrayal while it was happening. It felt like logistics, like something responsible people do. That's exactly the danger of it, I said. Betrayal rarely announces itself as betrayal while it's happening. It usually just feels efficient. I don't know how to undo this, she said. You don't undo it, I told her. You don't get to erase 14 months of planning around my death like it never happened. What you can do is spend whatever years I have left proving the sentence wasn't the whole truth of how you see me. That's not undoing damage. That's building something new next to it, and hoping, eventually, the new thing gets tall enough that the old thing stops being the first thing anyone notices. Kevin called 2 days later, which surprised me, because Kevin rarely called outside of birthdays and holidays, and this was neither. Denise told me what happened, he said, without much preamble, in the flat, careful tone he'd used with me since he was a teenager negotiating curfew extensions. About the trust. I figured she would, I said. For what it's worth, Kevin said. I always thought it was strange how much time she spent up at that cabin the last few years compared to how little I got up there. I used to think it was just geography. Guess it was something else too. Careful, I said. Don't turn this into a competition about who loves their father correctly from 3,000 miles away versus who loves him incorrectly from 20 minutes down the road. Neither one of you gets to win that argument by pointing at the other. He laughed, short and a little embarrassed. Fair. I didn't call to score points, Dad. I called because I don't know. Hearing that sentence secondhand rattled me too. Made me wonder what I've let myself get lazy about being so far away. It's easy to tell yourself distance is a good excuse for not calling more. I don't know that it actually is one. It isn't, I said, not unkindly. But it's a more honest failure than what your sister did. You never pretended to be close and then planned around my absence behind a closeness you didn't actually maintain. You were just distant, plainly, the way you've always been distant. I can live with a plain failure a lot easier than a hidden one. I want to do better, Kevin said. I don't know exactly what that looks like from out here, but I wanted you to know I meant it. Start with calling more than birthdays. The rest tends to figure itself out once the habit's in place. We talked for almost 40 minutes that day, longer than any phone call between us in years, about nothing especially important: his job, my woodworking class, whether the Lions had a real shot this season, which they didn't, though we both pretended otherwise for the sake of the conversation. It wasn't a repair. Not yet. But it was, I think, the first honest brick laid toward one. And I've learned at 68 that you don't get to skip the laying of individual bricks just because you'd prefer the wall already finished. Denise came back the following Sunday, alone this time, without Curtis, carrying a small paper bag that turned out to contain a bundle of iris bulbs from the garden center out past the highway. I know it's not the same, she said, standing awkwardly in my doorway, but I wanted to plant something at the cabin. For Mom. I should have done it years ago instead of just assuming the irises would keep coming back on their own forever. I let her in. We didn't talk about the trust again that day, or the message, or 14 months of quiet planning. We drove up to Lake Wren together, the two of us, windows down the whole way, and we knelt on the path near the dock and planted new bulbs alongside the stubborn old ones that had, in fact, kept coming back on their own every single year regardless of whether anyone deserved them to. Mom used to say something about grief and simplifying, Denise said, patting soil around a bulb with more care than I think she'd shown anything in months. I only half remembered it until you... I looked the rest of it up in her old journal after you left the other night. What did it say? That grief makes people want to simplify everything, and sometimes the thing they're trying to simplify is the only thing holding the family together. She looked up at me, eyes wet again, but steadier this time. I think I simplified you, Dad, before you were even gone. I turned you into a variable in a spreadsheet instead of a person I was supposed to be paying attention to. You did, I agreed, because there wasn't any kindness in pretending otherwise. The question now isn't whether that happened, it's whether you're willing to spend the time it takes to stop. I am, she said. I don't expect you to believe that today. I just want you to know I mean it. I didn't answer right away. Some promises, I've learned, don't need an immediate response. They need time to prove themselves against the ordinary weight of an ordinary life. Phone calls that happen because someone wants to talk, not because a lawyer's deadline forced the conversation. Visits that happen on a random Tuesday, not scheduled around estate paperwork. A daughter who calls to ask how her father's doing, rather than how much longer he's expected to be doing it. Ellen called a few weeks after the planting, to walk me through the finalized trust language one last time before it went permanently on file. We met at her office again, the same worn chairs, the same smell of old paper and coffee, though this time the conversation felt less like triage and more like ordinary business. You seem more settled than you did the last time you sat in that chair, she said, sliding the final documents across her desk for my signature. I am, I said, and found, saying it out loud, that it was true. I spent a long time assuming that protecting myself from being taken for granted would feel like punishing the people I love. It doesn't actually. It feels more like finally respecting myself enough to require the same honesty from them that I've always given freely. That's a healthier place to land than most people manage, Ellen said. You'd be surprised how many clients come through that door wanting revenge dressed up as estate planning. What you built isn't revenge. It's a fence with a gate still in it. A fence with a gate, I repeated. I like that better than anything I came up with on my own. Use it, she said, smiling. I won't even charge you for the phrase. I signed the final documents that afternoon, the trust now permanent, unshakable by anyone's convenience, mine included, because I decided, somewhere in those 6 weeks of quiet, deliberate reconstruction, that some structures shouldn't move fast just because someone finally apologized for wanting them to move faster. Denise and I made the drive up to Lake Wren together 3 more times that summer, always on ordinary weekends, never tied to any occasion that required. The second visit, we replaced the leaning dock boards that had been threatening to give way since before Margaret got sick, working side by side with a level and a box of galvanized screws, while Denise complained cheerfully about how her father had apparently never once in 40 years considered hiring an actual contractor for anything. Your mother liked watching me do it wrong the first time and right the second, I told her. Said it was more honest than paying someone to make it look easy. That sounds exactly like something she'd say, Denise said, and for the first time since March, I heard something in her voice that sounded less like guilt working overtime to prove itself, and more like simple, uncomplicated affection, the kind that doesn't need to announce its own repair, because it's too busy actually being repair. The third visit, in late August, Curtis came too, hesitant at first, hanging back near the car as though he expected the invitation to be revoked the moment he stepped fully onto the property. I watched him stand at the edge of the dock for a long while, looking out at the water, before he finally came and sat beside me in the second folding chair, the one that had been Margaret's. I owe you a real apology, he said. Not the one I gave you at the kitchen table. That one was mostly about damage control. This one's just I've been thinking a lot about what kind of father-in-law I'd want to be 20 years from now if my own daughter ever marries someone like me. And I don't love the answer I keep landing on. That's a harder kind of honesty than most people manage on the first try, I said. I'll take it. I'm not asking you to trust me yet, Curtis said. I know that takes longer than one conversation on a dock. I just wanted you to know I'm not going to stop showing up while it does. We didn't say much else that afternoon. We didn't need to. Sometimes repair looks less like a speech and more like a man willing to sit quietly in a dead woman's folding chair, watching the same water she used to watch, learning patience the slow way because he'd finally understood there wasn't a faster one worth taking. I think often now about the difference between the two words that used to blur together in my mind before that Sunday in March: inevitable and convenient. My death is inevitable, the same as anyone's. I've never resented that fact, never fought it, never asked my children to pretend otherwise for my comfort. What I couldn't accept was watching that inevitability quietly reclassified as a convenience, something to be managed, timed around, waited out with the patience you'd extend to a long red light, rather than the patience you'd extend to a father you were dreading the loss of. Margaret used to say that people reveal what they actually believe about you not in the big declarations, but in the small logistics: who gets called first when something goes wrong, whose comfort gets prioritized when a decision needs making, whose feelings get factored into a plan and whose get filed away as an afterthought once the plan's already moving. For 14 months, I had been filed away. I hadn't noticed, because the filing had been done so gently, so reasonably, dressed up in language about being practical and simplifying things, that it never once announced itself as what it actually was. It took 4 lines of text on a laptop that wasn't mine to finally translate the filing into a language plain enough for me to act on. I'm grateful for that clarity now, even though I wasn't grateful for it in March, sitting at my daughter's kitchen table with my hands flat against the wood, trying to remember how to breathe. 6 months later, on a Saturday afternoon in October, Denise called just to talk. No occasion, no paperwork, no cabin, no trust, no lawyer's name attached to anything. Just her voice on the phone, asking how the woodworking class was going, whether I'd finished the bookshelf, whether I wanted to come up to Lake Wren the following weekend, just the two of us, to see how the irises had taken. I'd like that, I told her, and I meant it in a way that surprised me with how simple it felt. "Dad," she said before we hung up, "I've been thinking about something. That night when you told us about the trust, you said building something new next to the damage, until eventually it gets tall enough that people stop noticing the old thing first. I remember. I want you to know I'm trying to build it," she said. "Not because I want anything back in that estate, because I don't want to be the kind of person who talks about her father like he's already gone while he's still on the phone with her, asking about her day." I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up, out on my back porch, looking toward the tree line the way I used to look toward Margaret, whenever she said something that needed sitting with rather than answering right away. I thought about the trust Ellen had drafted, still standing, still protecting the cabin from being carved up by anyone's convenience, mine included, because I decided some things shouldn't move fast just because someone finally apologized for wanting them. I thought about 43 missed calls in half an hour, and what it had taken to finally answer the last one instead of the first. I thought about Margaret, sitting in that same folding chair on that same dock, telling me not to let grief simplify what deserved to stay complicated. I hadn't let it. Not entirely. I'd let the anger simplify things for exactly as long as it needed to, long enough to protect what mattered, long enough to make the truth impossible to keep quietly circling around, and then I'd let it go. The way you let go of a tool once the repair is finished, trusting the structure to hold on its own from there. That October, Denise brought her youngest, my granddaughter Iris, named, deliberately, the year after Margaret's diagnosis, in a gesture I hadn't fully understood the weight of until years later up to Lake Wren for the first time in 3 summers. She was 9, gap-toothed, endlessly curious about the smoking wood stove and the leaning dock we'd only half fixed, and she spent an entire afternoon planting her small hands in the dirt beside the irises her mother and I had put in that spring, asking questions about her great-grandmother she'd never met, but somehow already seemed to understand. "Grandpa," she said, patting soil around a bulb with the same careful seriousness her mother had shown months earlier, "will these flowers still be here when I'm big? If somebody keeps coming back to check on them," I said. "Yes. They don't need much. Just somebody who remembers they're worth checking on." She nodded, satisfied with that answer in the uncomplicated way children are satisfied with true things stated simply, and went back to digging. I sat in the folding chair and watched her, and thought that whatever else came of that trust, whoever eventually inherited a cabin with a leaning dock and a smoking stove, and 31 years of stubborn, unkillable irises, it would go to whichever child of this family kept showing up to check on it. Not the one who called it an asset. The one who called it home. If this story hit home for you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more real stories like mine. And let us know in the comments, would you have changed your will that fast? Or would you have waited to see if they'd tell you the truth on their own?